Hi everyone and welcome to my guide for the Death Trap Rogue in Season 6. Now that I have accomplished most of my goals with the Spiritborn in the season, I have moved on to the Rogue and I had an absolute blast with this. I've been playing this for the last few days and I have actually pushed very high with this build. In fact, I did write a max roll guide for the Death Trap Rogue before Season 6 launched. I've recently updated it a little bit with some of the recent changes like the Shroud of False Death, and this build can actually reach Pit 100 plus. There is a recorded 101 clear. It can maybe go a little bit further than that. Personally, I've pushed up to 95 of this on hardcore with slightly suboptimal gear. So 100 is definitely in reach if I would upgrade my character a little bit more. And it's a very fast and fun speed farming build, and it works very differently from most other rogue builds, in the sense that we actually use an ultimate skill to deal damage. You might have seen the Rain of Arrows stuff lately, for example, and we use a very similar combo in this build that revolves around Beastfall Boots and Preparation. So the idea is that you get your Death Trap cooldown down to 10 seconds or slightly above that, so that you can use 2 preparation resets at once in order to reset the Death Trap cooldown. And if you look at my skill bar here, for example, I'm constantly spamming my Death Trap. This is our main attack here in this build. We can cast it like 2 times per second or so, and in between our Death Trap casts we always have one barrage that actually triggers the Beastfall Boots in order to spend resources and get this energy refresh from preparation. Every time you spend 75, you get minus 5 seconds on your ultimate. If you spend 150 at once, you get 10 seconds off, giving you the instant Death Trap cooldown reset. So that's the main combo of the setup, and now just the difficult part is how do you actually reach 150 resources and restore it every single time. Well, restoring it is fairly easy thanks to the Eyes in the Dark pants that give you Aftermath ranks. Aftermath is a passive that gives you 25 resources whenever you cast your ultimate skill. You get many ranks with that, so you instantly refill your resources every time you press your ultimate. And then with the Beastfall Boots, you will instantly consume it. And then your resource bar looks very funny, just jumping up and down all the time. Which sounds really familiar when I have played Spiritborn before, I guess. And this is how most of the build works. The rest is mostly just mobility, extra damage buffs. We have the Caltrops, the Smoke Grenade, Dash and Shadow Step in here. So these are just kind of like interchangeable tools for the most part. But Death Trap is the star of the show, and it's a very fun build. It also has a really cool visual and sound effects, which I love about this build. You pull everything in together all the time, so you can kind of clump monsters together and just, you know, run into a pack, and everything is like CC'd, and it's just really fun and a cool fantasy to play with. So for Rogue standards, this is a pretty competitive choice. I've also been speed farming up to Pit 80 or so with this in around 2 to 2.5 minutes with this, which is fairly comparable to, for example, what Dance of Knives can do, or some of the other top rogue builds out there. It doesn't push the highest. We have, for example, Rapid Fire and the Overpower Flurry that can go a bit beyond this here when it comes to post 100 pit progression. But you can get your glyphs done, and you can farm anything in the game easily. You can do tormented bosses very easily on Torment 4. All of that is no problem. So let's jump into it. So here's the macro guide that I mentioned. Recently it has got a bit of an overhaul. A few days ago I updated the guide. You can also see the changelog here if I have been following it beforehand already. So I changed the runes a little bit. I added some extra steps in the progression. Changed the mythic variant to Shroud. Shroud of False Death is just a very powerful item that goes into many builds these days, including this one. So I switched the setup around a little bit. You can also see the different build variants here that have the starter, the ancestor variant, and then the mythics and the variations of it, which are actually not really massive. But you can kind of like progress with your rogue. If you're just starting a rogue, for example, after playing another class, then you'll see how this will go. There are some steps in the progression here where you actually change the setup quite a bit, because as I mentioned at the start, you need to have a 10-second Death Trap cooldown. This is like your primary objective here. And then 150 maximum resources with the Beastfall Boots. So this is not too easy to achieve when you have starter gear, and in fact kind of impossible when you don't really have like Tempers and Masterworks. So for example, at the start we play with the Exposure Key passive here. This is an alternative way to reset your Death Trap cooldown. So if you have the Eyes in the Dark and you want to get started with this build with nothing, this is actually what I have done leveling my rogue. I found these pants at like level 30, and then I decided, okay, let's go, we're gonna do Death Trap now. And it works pretty fine, but ultimately you want to get to the point where you just instantly reset your Death Trap every single time consistently without relying on the lucky hits from the Exposure Key passive, and we actually go with close quarters combat for extra damage, extra attack speed. Just makes the setup more powerful basically. It is also possible without the cooldown from the Harlequin Crest. This one is a really big help in reaching this breakpoint, but it is possible if you invest quite a bit, but you still need a bunch of cooldown on your items here. You need to masterwork at RP to have trap cooldown reduction, and then you can get to the point where Death Trap has 10 seconds. So it's not very easy, but achievable if you don't have the Harlequin Crest yet. Most of the rest of the setup is fairly straightforward. You just try to stack up a bunch of generic damage buffs. For example, you have a two-handed conceded aspect here. You have the Death Trap, doubled cast or double damage temper here. You actually just need 2 weapons of that. Don't even need to masterwork it, like crit it or something like that. Just good rolls, get it to 12, and you're at 100% chance. And like this, we can actually have, for example, an elemental surge temper here. This is mostly just quality of life. Early on, you can also go with triple Death Trap temper, for example. Make sure you hit 100%. But later on, you can do something like this here, and the poison damage, for example, helps you to trigger something like a chemical advantage a little bit more easily or so. But it's overall not a huge deal. Then we have the retribution aspect here, more damage to stunned enemies. We have elements, kind of a weak aspect, but this is what we got. There's not that many things that actually buff Death Trap, unfortunately. Cold Clip as well, even weaker than that. We don't even have a basic skill, it's just here for the extra damage. In pushing, I was also running with smiting aspect because it gives you extra crowd control duration, which also seems like a decent option here. And here we have inner calm, so when you stand still, you get the extra bonus as well. So unfortunately, all the aspects that go into this build are not really great besides conceded, which we trigger easily with second wind. So we actually have very high barrier generation. We basically have 100% barrier all the time. This is a fairly tanky build, in fact, because you have the Shaco as well. You have lots of life, and then we have the barrier like every second, like 2 times we get a full barrier. So this is pretty crazy. And some other damage buffs we have here is the Fist of Fate. So we don't really care that much about lucky hits outside of getting the crowd controls for the stagger. So this is helpful, especially on the higher pits when you try to push a little bit beyond pit 90 or so towards pit 100. Then you need to stagger the bosses to deal really good damage. But Death Trap has the upside. It actually has relatively decent boss damage, even when you're not staggering. And this is because of this effect here, the Supreme Death Trap. It says that enemies that resist the Death Trap pull are hit again for 120% of the Death Trap damage. So in most fights, this will actually not activate because you're just blasting down monsters and you usually pull them, and unless they're solvable or something like that. But for bosses, you actually get this effect permanently. So you actually have relatively good boss damage output compared to your AoE damage in the run. So for example, even when you're pushing, you can actually get to like, you know, pit 95 plus or something where you still kill the boss in 2 minutes or less. So that's really nice about this build. It's not like these 7-minute long boss fights with like a huge RNG of which boss you get. So there's obviously some RNG, but it's way better than the usual, I would say. And lastly, at least in Mythic variant, I have the Ring of Stardust Skies here. This is also really nice, 50% unconditional damage buff. We just need to ramp it up, which is easy. Has a really good stat line. We don't care about the core skill ranks. We have Barrage, but in fact, I don't even have a point in Barrage in this build. You could put like 3 points here if you want, and this would save you rolling the chance to make enemies vulnerable here. So you get like 1 roll on your ring, but it's also nothing really big. And there's actually a lot of really good passes you can pick up all over the tree. So I'd rather save those 3 points, but this is like an alternative way of doing this if you don't have such a ring. For your tempers, you want a lot of close damage. This is because of the close quarters combat. It scales with damage to close enemies. You also want 1 Caltrops duration, especially for higher tiers where you fight bosses a little bit longer. The Caltrops duration makes this like way more smooth. So I really like having one. Technically, it's a downgrade, but you don't have to press a Caltrops every 5 seconds or so. You can actually put it down and it lasts the entire stagger phase and so on. So I really like playing with that, and I have this here. You also have trap cooldown reduction. This may or may not be needed depending on how much cooldown you actually have here on your setup. You can also, for example, make up with some masterworks on the Beastfall boots, try to get a greater affix maybe on the ultimate cooldown like this. You can also have the Shaco here, you can masterwork this. You just need to make sure that your in-game tooltip or the Death Trap says 10 seconds or maybe slightly more, like 10.2 seconds or so is okay. In that case, you will get the instant cooldown reset. Our rune setup looks like this. We have Yule and Mod, at least in the late game. So this is whenever you cast a skill for cooldown, you gain a Dark Shroud after 3 casts. So this is our way of generating Dark Shrouds. So there's like 3 different ways. You can either press it, you can have Umbrous aspect, or you can have the rune. And in this case, we choose the rune because everything here is unique. We don't actually have a slot for a defensive power unless you put it on the neck, which we don't want to do. So the rune is actually a relatively good choice here. And then we also have Sun and Vex. This is cast an ultimate skill and then gain +3 to all skills. +3 to all skills is actually pretty nice, even if you have 9 together with the Harlequin crest. This is still a pretty sizable damage buff of like 16% or so. So better than a Warcry, for example. And the extra skills also give us, let's say, Dark Shroud for extra defense. That's probably also like a 10% defense buff or something like that. Plus you get potentially faster cooldowns on your dash and these kind of things. So it's kind of nice to have the extra cooldown, the extra skill ranks here, and we activate this all the time. We have a lot of offering generation. Since we cast our ultimate skill like 2 times per second or so, this triggers very easily. One note here is that it's kind of tight with resistances and armor, especially the resistances are not that easy to fill because we have this full unique line of armor pieces here. We can't really roll all of resistances on our gear. So I have resistances on a ring, for example. You can also try to like master it a little bit if you have to, or get a greater affix on this. And we also have triple diamonds, and the rest comes from the Paragons. And here's also the star disguise that has a double always, which is very helpful for this. Also, we have an armor roll on the neck. This is kind of important because, again, we don't have any armor, we don't have any skulls. So this armor roll is kind of required in order to cap out. So you should try to look for one. And finally, our Paragon looks like this. So we have these 4 boards here: Cheap Shot, Deadly Ambush, Exploit Weakness, No Witness. And our glyphs are Control, Turf, Ambush, Snare, and Versatility. So you overall have like access to a lot of really good choices here. These are powerful legendary nodes. We get extra damage against crowd controlled. We have the extra damage to trapped enemies, which we actually trigger from the death trap itself. It gives you like a little window of like around a second or so where enemies are counted as affected by traps. So this is basically always active. You don't have to even rely on the counters for this, for example. We have Exploit Weakness. This kind of passively stacks up and gives you a damage buff. And No Witnesses, since we can stack a lot of ultimate damage here very easily. We also put it on our diamond gems here. For example, we have the pants as well, and we also have the nodes on the board itself that are buffed by the glyph. You get a lot of ultimate damage, and No Witnesses gives you a massive damage buff. If you're not Paragon 300, most likely, then you can also go check, for example, the other steps here. We have, you know, for example, with less points spent, it's like 250 Paragon, this is like 200 Paragon. So you can go check this. You can also see this in our Maxwell guide here, for example. There are these progression sliders. The same for the skill tree as well. There's like some steps that change a little bit. So as you level up, there's like the starter variant with exposure, there's ancestral, here's mythic, and so on. So you can actually see how their skill. So you can actually see how the skills progress a little bit, especially from the switch from starter to ancestral, where you actually have enough cooldown to reset your death trap all the time. There's a kind of like a big change here. And then Mythic has some other tweaks. And that's also pretty much it for this guide. So I had a blast with the Death Trap Rogue. I will probably play it some more as well, but I've also been starting to try some other builds. I want to play a bit of Victimize, Barrage. Currently playing a very fun Casino Rogue that relies on Frostburn, Azarath, and Doombringer. Full lucky hit combo. It's also pretty fun. But the Death Trap Rogue is pretty solid. I think we have moved it into A tier now in endgame tier list. So it's overall pretty nice and can do everything in the game just fine. There's just one last note here, which is that the preparation seems to have a slight bug sometimes where even if you spend 150 energy, you don't actually get a 10 seconds cooldown reset on your death trap. This seems to happen especially at the start of a run. So when you go in every time, the first time you cast death trap, for some reason, it doesn't work. But then afterwards, it usually just works for the rest of the run. So that's just something to be aware of. This is something I noticed and I reported, but let's see if that is going to get fixed. Either way, it's not a huge downside to the build because you just lose like 2 seconds at the start or something, and that's about it. Because you just spam more barrage and you're fine. But I wanted to get that note out. In any case, hope you liked this video here. Wish you good luck with the rogue, and see you guys next time.